Okay, so now I'm going to share. The reason I wanted to do this is I wanted to play for you this audio illusion. As I mentioned last time, there's optical, audio, and logical illusions. We all know about optical illusions. The audio illusion is really interesting. This is called Shepard's glissando, and it's an audio illusion that keeps on increasing in pitch, although it doesn't increase in pitch, but it sounds like it's always going up. I tell you, that's a little bit creepy, isn't it? It seems like it keeps going up. They use it in movies a lot. And there's an interesting trick behind it. And if you're into music and notation and frequency and stuff like that, you can probably Google it and figure out why the Shepherd's glissando does what it does. And it's really fascinating. There's also a glissando which goes down. It sounds like the music goes down forever and ever and ever. So that's a possibility also. So I wanted to play that for you because it's kind of interesting. We talked about meta-analysis, and meta-analysis allows us to, and I talked about this last time, and let me just review it a little bit. Meta-analysis allows us to have a logical tool to do things. As I believe I mentioned last time, the Cretans are always liars. That's from the Bible, Titus 1:12. And this is a Cretan, and suppose that the Cretan says everything I say is a lie. Well, if everything he says is a lie, well, that means he just lied. And if he lied, he's telling you the truth. But if he's telling you the truth, he just lied. But if he just lied, he's telling you the truth. So round and round it goes. This is what I would refer to as a logical illusion because there is no resolution to it. And what do we do with optical illusions? We assume that they're not real. Same thing with audio illusions, optical illusions were not real. It's the same thing with logical illusions. They're not real. They don't exist in reality. They're just statements which, if you apply them to themselves, are just they're just kind of stupid. So no, they don't exist. And so round and around we go in a so-called strange loop. We talked about the brothers, one of which always told the truth, the other one which never lied, and one of them, and you don't know which one is which. You don't know which one always tells the truth. You don't know which one lies. And it turns out every time you ask them a question, they charge you $1,000. So you have to be very clever when you talk to them. One of them always lies. The other one never lies. And so they hold up these signs, I never lie. And both of them are saying something which is consistent with their character. The person that never lies, he says, I never lie. He's telling the truth. The guy that always lies say, I never lie. He's holding up to his background because he's a liar. And therefore he would say, I never lie, because I never lie is a lie. And that's what the guy does. So the question is, what about these guys? What about if you were to ask them a question and the story that I gave you was about Epimenides, the liar, and his twin brother, honest Thomas. And you were coming to a fork in the road. And I used the Apostle Paul as he was traveling with Timothy. And Timothy tells Paul, one of them always lies, one of them always tells the truth, which, and you don't want to pay these guys a lot because it's $1,000 a question. So how much do you pay them in order to, what's the minimum amount you can pay them? Can you get by with one question? And you only get access to one, and you can ask them a question. The answer is yes. So it turns out these logical illusions, when the guys say, I never lie, actually have some benefit. If I ask your brother which road leads to Corinth, what would he say? The one that never lies would say, well, let's see, my brother is a liar. And so he would give you the wrong road. So he would point to the wrong road. The guy that lies says that his brother would point to the right road, but since he always lies, he would point to the wrong road also. So both of them with this question would point to the wrong road. Really a great model in the way things happen. I think very, very clever. And so in both cases, you would be pointed to the road that was wrong, and you would take the opposite road. So you could resolve this with one question. Uh, it also can be applied philosophically. You have heard that there is no absolute right and wrong. Everybody has their truth. Everything is relative. There is no right or wrong. And then you can simply ask them the question and say, well, not question, but you could say, I disagree. I think there is absolute right and wrong. And your opponent will say, well, you're wrong. And you're right. Absolutely. They have just, through their argument, defending their position, actually shown that their statement is, if you will, a logical illusion. You can't say there is absolutely no right and wrong, all is relative. This is called meta-analysis, by the way. If you take a statement or an idea in mathematics or something else and you apply it to itself and it refutes itself, you have a self-refuting statement, and the original statement is a logical illusion. So that's an example of there is no absolute right and wrong. All is relative. You like my pictures? I'm very proud of them, by the way. Another one is skeptics. You hear people that says, well, Christianity, all this religion stuff. I'm skeptical of all things. Well, you can always ask them, are you skeptical of skepticism? Are you skeptical of your own views if you're skeptical of everything? So again, this is meta-analysis. This is applying a statement to itself. And you can see in this case, it can be used to debunk the idea that I'm skeptical of all things, including being skeptical of skeptical system, being skeptical of skeptical thing, being skeptical of being skeptical. Okay, I'm tripping over my tongue here. So again, notice this is meta-analysis. It's application of the statement to itself, and it shows a contradiction, therefore a logical illusion. One that we hear quite a bit, by the way, from materialists and naturalists, it says only things proven by science can be believed. They believe that the universe can be totally explained by science, and that's their statement. Only things proven by science can be believed. Well, let's apply that statement to itself. If that's true, can you prove this scientifically? Can you prove your statement scientifically? Because in order to believe what you say, in order to do that, you have to prove it by science. Well, you can't prove that. That's a statement in philosophy. It's a statement in ideology. And certainly there is certainly it's a self-refuting statement, so therefore an optical illusion. You're not allowed to say stuff like that. Okay, you cannot prove that only things being proven by science can be believed. So I love these logical illusions, and they have a lot of good use in mathematics, by the way. Here is one. This is Deepak Chopra, and he's a prominent figure in the New Age movement, or at least he was. And after a talk, one of the men in the crowd came up and said, now, you stated before that all belief is a cover-up for insecurity, right? And Deepak said, yes, I believe that all belief is a cover-up for insecurity. And the man says, do you believe that? And he said, yes. And the man said, thank you, and did a mic drop. So here's the actual audio.
I want to take another question. There's a gentleman in the red shirt back there. He's had his hand up for a while. Come up to the microphone.
My question's for Deepak and the bishop. Now, you stated before that all belief is a cover-up for insecurity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you believe that?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I find that to be hilarious. Again, it's an application of meta-analysis where you take a statement and you apply it to itself, and it turns out to be a self-refuting idea, and that's a it turns out to be a logical illusion that all belief is a cover-up for insecurity. If you believe that, well, then you're insecure also. Now we use these meta-analysis and so-called reductio ad absurdum proofs in mathematics. Here is a fun example, and this is just kind of a joke example, where you have a theorem and you want to prove that all positive integers are interesting. Okay, that's an interesting proposition. So can you show that that statement is an optical or is a logical illusion by this reduction to the absurd? And here's the way you do it. You say, well, assume if all positive integers are interesting, assume there is a smallest uninteresting positive integer. So if there are uninteresting integers, there is a smallest uninteresting positive integer. And then you make the conclusion, well, that's interesting. So therefore, you have disproven the theorem that all positive integers are interesting. Okay. So, well, let's see. Do I have that right? You've proven that all positive integers are interesting. Okay. So this is a proof. And again, this is kind of a joke. It's kind of a fun thing, but I think that in other places that it has some very interesting applications. So all positive integers are interesting, fascinating. And then there's Berry's paradox. We're starting to get a little bit more serious. This was actually proposed, I think, to Bertrand Russell by his barber. And he said, and this barber's name was Berry. And he says, do you notice X? Let's define X as the smallest positive integer that requires more than 20 words to define. X is the smallest positive integer that requires more than 20 words to define. Okay, think about that. Um, well, it turns out that that's kind of a self-refuting paradox in a very strange way, because when you say X is the smallest positive integer that requires more than 20 words to define, you've just defined X using 15 words. In that statement, there are 15 words. So you've used 15 words to define the smallest positive integer that requires more than 20 words to define. You've defined it in 15 words. And so I find that really interesting. And if it was indeed Bertrand Russell's barber, the guy was pretty sharp. He recognized that indeed there was a logical illusion there, if you will. So logical illusions, reductio ad absurdum, has been used by a lot of people, and here are three that did it. One was Kurt Gödel, Alan Turing, and Gregory Chaitin. Kurt Gödel in the 1930s, well, in the early 30s, toppled mathematics with his incompleteness theorem. We'll go over that. Alan Turing, the father of modern computer science in the 30s also, he's in the middle here. He showed that there were things non-algorithmic. And how did he do that? He did that using, if you will, a logical illusion, a self-contradictory statement. And then the guy on the right, Gregory Chaitin, was one of the fathers of algorithmic information theory. Alan Turing showed that there was one thing that was non-algorithmic and therefore non-computable. Gregory Chaitin actually generalized this and showed there was a bunch of things that were non-algorithmic. And so therefore, there's a whole slew of problems which cannot be solved by computers. And that, to me, is incredibly fascinating. So this illustrates if you will, a limitation to computers. So let's talk about Kurt Gödel, by the way. Gödel, got to say that right. One of the interesting things is Gödel was a kind of a closet Christian, and he offered after his death an ontological proof that God exists. And you can look at Gödel's ontological proof on on Wikipedia, and you can find these equations here. So here was his proof based on Anselm's ontological proof for the existence of God, that God does exist. And so therefore at the bottom, it says theorem 4 at the bottom. So therefore there exists a God. So it's kind of fun if you get into a debate. As a Christian, I get into debates, and sometimes I don't want to debate people because they're not even talking in the right universe about God and things. And so I show him this, and I said, well, here's a mathematical proof that God exists. So I show him Gödel's proof of the existence of God, and then I say, well, take a look at it, and then if you have any questions, let's get up and talk about it. So yeah, you show him that kind of shuts down the conversation. Now, what's interesting is that this is very, very cool. I actually did an interview with a former graduate student, and try to make it available on the web, that actually breaks down each of these steps and explains them in English to show Gödel's original proof. So he was an interesting guy and just a brilliant guy. He was good friends with Albert Einstein. In fact, when Gödel came up with U.S. citizenship, Einstein went in and stood with him. They were both at the Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies, where smart people go to not do anything anymore. Usually, when you make it to the Princeton Institute, that you don't. There's very few things that you do anymore which are remarkable. So Einstein, of course, had his relativity, his Nobel Prize. Gödel had his incompleteness proof, and they both went there. And they did marginal things, but really nothing substantial. It turns out that the Nobel laureate, oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank on his name, Richard Feynman. There it is, Richard Feynman, who was also a Nobel Prize winner, was offered residency at the Princeton Institute. It was a really sweet gig because you go there, you get your office, you get a secretary, and you're just set for life. They say you're so daggone smart, you can just sit here and do stuff, and we'll pay your salary and take care of you and do all of this stuff. And so anyway, Richard Feynman was offered a position at the Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies, and he says, "No, I'm not going to do that." He said, "People go there, and shoot, if I went there, I would no longer have interaction with my students, and that's where I get my ideas. That's where things come in and keep me fresh." We talked, I think it was in the first or second lecture, about the idea that the older you get, the more entrenched you get. And so it's always good, I think, for professors to be around young people and be able to feed off of them. I had a PhD student who was like this, Eric Holloway. He would come to me and he would have these harebrained ideas, just harebrained. But I knew that he was young and he had some, he was just thinking. He was trying to think. He was trying to do things which are new. And so I made it a point to always listen to him. And sometimes the results that he came out with were brilliant. And we were actually able to use these and publish a lot of them. But there was a lot of filtering in order to get to the good ideas. But Eric was just a fountain of ideas. And I hope that you guys working with your professors, when you come up with new ideas, have the freedom to share them with your professor. And I would hope that your professor would take the time to listen, even though he might not agree. So this is Einstein and Gödel. Now, what did Gödel do? Why was he at the Princeton Institute for Advanced Study? He was there because he gave the foundation for the halting problem, and that was not his proof. His proof was incompleteness, and I'm not going to go through the proof because it's not that. It's pretty complicated, and I really haven't studied it. I do understand Turing's proof. But Alan Turing in the 1930s, when he invented computers, was saying, my computer is an answer and an example, if you will, of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And that was astonishing. And as a result, Alan Turing invented the computer. And this was a famous, I think you've seen these cartoons on. And this is using kind of the idea of a logical illusion. So these surveyors are saying, hey, Gödel, we're completing a comprehensive list of fetishes. What turns you on? And he said, anything not on your list. So therefore, it's impossible for them to complete their list with Gödel because he said anything not on your list. So it's one of those self-refuting paradoxes. If they put it on the list, then then that's not what Gödel says. So they're not allowed to put it on the list. I thought this was really interesting of an idea that we had. Here is Gödel's proof simplified. He came up with the incompleteness theorem. And let me tell you what he said. And this is a gross simplification of Gödel's proof. He said, eventually, if you come up with a formal logic, where you have axioms, you're all familiar with axioms and postulates, where you talk about some specific assumptions which are obviously true, and then after the obvious conclusion or obvious axioms, you develop a whole field of mathematics. I mean, the first to do that, the guy that really did this well was Euclid, way in the BC when he founded planar geometry. He came up with some just obvious things. Okay, the closest distance between 2 points is a straight line. And I think he had 4 or 5 different axioms. And from this, he developed all of the mathematics for planar geometry. And there's other mathematics. Great mathematics start this way. One of them was Kolmogorov's sophistication of the theory of probability. He came up with the idea that let's state some axioms about probability and then prove the field of probability. And I believe he had also 5 axioms. So these are foundations. So here was what Kurt Gödel did. He said, if you have a set of axioms, then you cannot prove all of mathematics. There was a time when people were trying to derive all of mathematics from a basic set of axioms, from a basic set of assumptions. I think I've mentioned previously that it was Bertrand Russell and Whitehouse that developed 2 volumes of a book called Principia Mathematica, where they tried indeed to do this. And they started with some things, and I think with the end of the second book, they got up to the level of 2 + 2 = 4 or something like that. But they were trying to meticulously develop a theory which could encompass all of mathematics. What Gödel did, he said, anytime you have a set of axioms, you are going of a certain sophistication, if you will, you're going to come up with a theorem eventually, and we're going to call it theorem X. And he said that theorem X cannot be proved. Whoa. Okay, let's think about that. Theorem X is that theorem X cannot be proved. Notice the self-reference. In a lot of these logical illusions, we have this meta-analysis where we apply a concept to itself. That's what we have here. Theorem X talks about theorem X. It points back to itself. So theorem X says theorem X cannot be proved. Okay. Well, that's interesting. So this is either something which he can prove with his axioms or he couldn't prove with his axioms. So if we don't prove theorem X, then the system is incomplete. In other words, there's certain aspects of mathematics which we can't explore with the current axioms. And by the way, if you include theorem X as an additional axiom, it turns out, there's another axiom down the road that's going to be incomplete. So if we don't prove theorem X, the system is incomplete. It means that there are things which you can't prove. If we prove theorem X, then the system is inconsistent, meaning that it's like you prove that 4 is equal to 7 or something like that. And you don't want an inconsistent proof. So what's our conclusion here? It isn't actually a logical illusion, but it illustrates something, and illustrates that it has to be incomplete. That's the only logical solution if you have a consistent mathematics. If you have a consistent mathematics, theorem X is going to come up to say that theorem X cannot be proved. So there are things, no matter what you assume, it's eventually going to lead to a conclusion that there are things which you can't prove. And this is pretty heavy because this means that there's no universal set of axioms which can capture all of mathematics. And this totally derailed Russell and Whitehouse's work. And it's called one of the greatest works of the 20th century that nobody has ever read because they were so techy and so detailed in the mathematics. Yeah, totally derailed this idea of trying to find everything. And it was Kurt Gödel. He was kind of a little nerd, and he came and gave this presentation in the early 1930s at a conference, and nobody knew what he was talking about except one guy, John von Neumann. John von Neumann was a genius, just one of the greatest geniuses of the 20th century. He did, you probably, if you're in computer, you've heard of the von Neumann architecture. In signal processing, we have von Neumann's alternating projection theorem. And he was a good guy. Elon Musk now is talking about Mars. I think it was von Neumann that says, yeah, we could send stuff to Mars, but what we should do is send up a bunch of robots first because Mars is red because there's lots of iron deposits there. We could set up a manufacturing plant and actually have the robots construct a habitat that would contain humans. And and of course, a byproduct, I didn't know this, and I don't know how it works, but he said a byproduct of doing this construction of getting the metal out of the iron ore generates a lot of oxygen. So we can store a lot of oxygen and therefore have a lot of oxygen available when people come up. I mean, the guy was just, he was a thinker outside the box. He was just incredible. So anyway, he was the one that attended Gödel's talk, and he says, "Oh my gosh, he knew exactly what this meant. This meant that this was astonishing." And talking to Gregory Chaitin, he says that people are still trying to understand Gödel's theorem. There's applications of it that we're still trying to understand. Does it imply that all of the knowledge that we have about creation and such is going to lead us to a truth that we can't prove? And I think the answer is probably yes. I mean, there are truths that we can't prove. It's really an interesting conclusion. Gödel is maybe one of the most important raw pieces of mathematics of the 20th century. Now, this impacted a lot of people, including Stephen Hawking. You've all heard of the idea that they're looking for a theory of everything. And this still eludes us. This still eludes us. We still don't have a theory of everything, a set of physical laws that explains all of the available forces. And string theory purports to show this, but string theory, thus far, is a myth, and I don't think it'll probably ever be proven. I know that we have some great people, Gerald Cleaver over in physics, who does string theory, and the guy is just brilliant. But the problem is experimental verification of string theory is terrible, because it turns out if you take let's just take a string. A string is on the order of, it's really, really small. And it's so small that if you took a string and scaled it to 1 inch, okay, you get the idea. It's so small. You take a string and you scale it to 1 inch, then the diameter of a proton is several light years across. That means strings are very, very, very small. And in order to verify string theory, we're going to have to go down and measure at this incredible rate. Again, if you took a string, you expanded it to the scale of 1 inch, that would make a proton several light years across. I mean, that is very, very small. So there are some people, including Roger Penrose, who have doubts that string theory will ever be proven experimentally. The mathematics is beautiful. I talked to one of Gerald's PhD students one time. He said, if string theory isn't true, the mathematics is so beautiful, it should be true. And yeah, maybe it is. But anyway, this was Gödel's impact on Stephen Hawking and the finding of everything. And let's see what Stephen Hawking said. He said, up to now, most people have implicitly assumed that there is an ultimate theory. Sometimes it's called a TOE, theory of everything, a TOE, theory of everything, that we will eventually discover. Indeed, I myself have suggested we might find it quite soon. Maybe it is not possible to formulate the theory of the universe in a finite number of statements, in a finite number of axioms, just like Gödel was talking about. He said this is very reminiscent of Gödel's theorem. This says that any finite system of axioms is not sufficient to prove every result in mathematics. Gödel showed that if you had a statement of assumptions, that whatever theory you developed would be incomplete. And this was what Hawking was saying. Even if we added to these things, it'd probably still be incomplete. So we see that the great genius Stephen Hawking was influenced by Gödel's theorem. And then Alan Turing came along and, with referencing some of Gödel's work, came up with mathematics. And he proved, to my knowledge, the first thing that was non-computable. And we're going to walk through this proof, and it's actually beautiful. It's very, very interesting. And on the right is kind of a discussion of Gödel's proof. And if you're into pseudocode, you can look at the pseudocode and you can see that things that is a self-refuting proposition. So here's the idea of the Turing halting problem. First of all, if we had a halting problem, then it should be a piece of software, which we call capital H here. And there's two inputs to this capital H. There is the actual input I, and then there's the computer program P. And then the halting problem, if it exists, would output either a H, meaning that the program halted. Remember the shampoo bottle? There was it halted if you said repeat once, and it looped if you just said repeat. And it would generate an H or an L, meaning it halted or it looped forever. And so we're just going to assume this exists and show that the assumption of this existence is self-refuting. So again, the input to the program is I, the program is P, and H is halt and L loops. One of the things that's important to remember here is both the input and the program are a string of binary numbers. And so they're a bunch of ones and zeros. So in a way, maybe it's hard to differentiate sometimes between a input and a program. There's a string of ones and zeros. And so you could actually mix them up, if you will, in what you're talking about. So here's the idea. If we had this piece of software, this H of PP, we could put it here in this corner, and we could actually use it in a greater piece of program, which we call N as a function of P. So the idea is that P is fed into the halting program. So both the input and the program are P. Again, it's a string of zeros and ones. And the H of P would come out and it would either halt or it would loop. So again, we put in P, both the input and the program, a string of binary numbers, are fed into this halting program. And the output is either H, it halts forever, and L for loops. Now, we're constructing a greater program using the halting oracle, which we've assumed exists. So if it exists, there has to be code for it. So we could use it as a subroutine, if you will, in order to generate a more difficult or a more complicated program. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. If it puts H in there, what we're going to do is we're going to feed it to a looping program. You can do a while loop. While 1 is equal to 1, and it just goes on forever. And this could be a very simple looping program. It could be the one of the shampoo bottle where it says repeat, and so it repeats forever. And so you have this looping program, and that is if the output of the halting oracle is an H. Now, if it is a loop, the loop comes out. And if the looping comes out, if this is recognized as a looping program, then we're going to have a program that halts while 1 is not equal to 1. Those should be the same font, but they're not. While 1 is equal to 1, and then that's what we're going to do. So it turns out that the program is going to either loop this meta program, this program that contains the original H, is going to either loop or it's going to halt. Now we have to ask ourselves the question, what about N? Does this big program surrounded by the green box, does it halt or does it loop forever? And that's the question that we are going to ask. Well, we ask the question, what about N of N? If we took this code for this big program inside the green box, and we used it as the N, would N with an input of N, notice the self-reference here again. The program is looking at itself as an input. So we have a lot of this self-reference in these logical illusions. And so we have n of n. Does n of n halt? Well, if n of n halts, okay, so if it halts, then it turns out that if you follow this, if n of n halts, then this is going to be, it's going to say it halts, but then that runs a looping program, which means it loops forever. So if it halts, it's going to loop forever. I'm going to show you another version of this problem, very interesting. And if it loops, okay, so we run it through the h of nn, it loops. If the halting problem says that it loops, well, it turns out it's going to halt. And so these are contradictory statements. And so they can't be true. It's a logical illusion. Here's another way to look at it. On the top is the program, the n of n, if you will. And we put in n, and at this stage, it says n of n halts because the halting oracle has said that it halts. However, the program itself loops. The halting oracle, the halting oracle says that it halts, but the entire program loops. Totally a self-contradiction. If n of n halts, then h of n and n announces h, but n of n loops forever. Isn't that interesting? This was basically Turing's proof. And suppose that, on the other hand, suppose that n of n loops. So we're asking this big program in the green box whether it loops or halts. Well, if it loops, then the halting oracle would say that it loops, but then the bigger program would halt. And so we have the contradictory statement that the oracle says that it loops, but the overall program says that it halts. I find that is just a fascinating, ingenious way of proving that halting oracles don't exist. We started out by assuming that a halting oracle exists. That's what this H is here. And if that H exists, then it's computer code, and we can put it inside a larger program, N, which is in the big green box. And then we see that there is a self-contradiction that occurs. So this is a proof of Turing's original idea that halting oracles don't exist. Halting oracles don't exist, meaning that the assumption that the halting oracle is a computer program cannot be true. So therefore, the halting oracle cannot be a computer program. It is non-computable. It is a logical illusion. Now, I don't know if Turing knew this when he did this, but the implications of a halting oracle are just astonishing. Turing did a lot of other stuff, by the way. He was the father of the Turing machine, which is the precursor of the modern computer. You know something else Turing does. A lot of people don't know this, but he actually studied and showed why zebras have stripes. He went into the biology of zebras and showed why zebras have stripes. I mean, the guy was just all over the place. So really fascinating stuff. So suppose we did have a halting oracle. If we did have a halting oracle and you came up with a way of doing a halting oracle and you came to me, we could work together and make millions of dollars. And here's how we can make millions of dollars. One is by proving some of the open problems in mathematics. Here is one. And I'm using these examples because they're very simple to state. What's the power of the halting oracle? Well, one is Goldbach's conjecture, and this is a conjecture that was in the 18th century, 1742. This guy, Goldbach, wrote Euler. Euler was maybe the greatest mathematician that ever lived. And he said, you know what? All even numbers greater than 4 can be expressed as the sum of 2 prime numbers. Think about that. All even numbers greater than 4 can be expressed as the sum of 2 prime numbers. Let's take the number 22. Well, it's 11 plus 11. 11 is prime. What about the number 32? I have to think about this one a second. 32 is 29 plus 3. 29 plus 3, oh, I have it down here. 29 plus 3 is 32. 144 is 131 plus 13. Both of these are prime numbers. And even 8, the lowly number 8, can be expressed as the sum of 5 and 3. And then we have the number 15,748, and that can be expressed as these two numbers, which I claim are prime. So Goldbach's conjecture has been tested for many, many numbers, but never proven. And there's an organization called the Clay Institute that offers $1 million prizes for people that can solve some of these problems. I don't know if Goldbach's conjecture is on that list, but certainly it has eluded proof for a number of years, and maybe someday it could be proven. Another one. By the way, let me illustrate this, or let me make a point here. How do you disprove Goldbach's conjecture? If you came up with a single counterexample, if you came up with a single counterexample, you could disprove Goldbach's conjecture. If you came up with an even number that could not be expressed by the sum of two primes, then you would disprove Goldbach's conjecture. Proving is much more difficult because you can't prove it for all of the infinite number of even numbers. You would have to prove it for all the infinite numbers. So it's going to take some advanced math. But to disprove, it's simple. Find a simple counterexample. And this has been tested for really, really big numbers. And nobody has found a counterexample as of yet for Goldbach's conjecture. Let me give you another one. This is Legender's conjecture. Does there always exist at least one prime between consecutive perfect squares? This is very interesting. So if you have consecutive perfect squares, 3 squared and 4 squared, that's between 9 and 16. So Legendre said there's at least one prime number in this interval, and that turns out to be 11. One of them is 11. There's also 13. 11 squared and 12 squared. Notice these are consecutive squared numbers, 121, 144. Well, it turns out that there's a number between those, which is prime. So this is also something which has never been proven. And again, it can be disproven by a single counterexample. Give me two integers, square them, and there's not a prime number between them. And in that case, yeah, you've disproven it. But proving it, you'd have to prove it for all consecutive numbers, and there's an infinite number of consecutive numbers, and you can't do that. Sometimes these sort of problems are called semi-decidable. And then the big one, the Riemann hypothesis. The real part of any non-trivial zeros of the Riemann zeta function is 1/2. I won't go into the theory behind this because, frankly, I haven't delved into it too much. But this is a problem which has been around for a heck of a long time. 1859, you can see there on the slide in very small print. So this is something which, if proved, would open up it would answer a lot of questions in number theory, because a lot of them show if Riemann's hypothesis is true, then we can prove all of these great and wonderful things. So in 2004, a couple of guys verified the Riemann hypothesis through the first 10 trillion non-trivial zeros. So again, they were looking for a counterexample, so they went up to 10 trillion non-trivial zeros. These are zeros like in the Laplace domain. You know what a zero is, where the function goes to zero. And this is one of the things that at the Clay Institute, there's a $1 million prize that has been offered by the Clay Mathematical Institute for the first correct proof of the Riemann hypothesis. Now, this is so popular that it actually appeared in the movie A Beautiful Mind. The Beautiful Mind was about a mathematician who had some mental problems named John Nash. And there's one scene where he's kind of scribbling on a window, and a kid comes in, he looks at the math, and he says, "Oh, you're messing around with the Riemann hypothesis." And he says, "Yeah, I don't think I'm going to get anywhere, but I think I've made some advances." So it's even made its appearance in some of the popular movies. And Russell Crowe is really great in the movie A Beautiful Mind, where he played John Nash. John Nash won an economics prize in economics for his proposal of the so-called equilibrium theorem, which basically understands why competition works, and that there's certain levels of competition that are better for everybody as opposed to like one or another person dominating it. So he's a really, really smart guy, but he did not have a beautiful mind. I read his biography. He was not a good man. Let me just say that. Okay, so let's go back. By the way, notice that we could disprove the Riemann hypothesis again if we could find one of these so-called non-trivial zeros that didn't lie at the proper place. We would just have to find a single counterexample. So for the Legendre case, for Goldbach's, for the Riemann hypothesis, we would have to find one counterexample. And so it's semi-provable. Nobody has found a counterexample. These people went through 10 trillion non-trivial zeros and they haven't found a counterexample yet, but they haven't proven it either. Because if you go to the first 10 trillion, that means that there are a lot more of these zeros to be looked at in the future. So yeah, well, that's just life, I guess. So let's go back and revisit the idea of a halting oracle. Here we have on the left, we have Goldbach. On the right, we have Turing. And suppose that we did have a halting oracle. Remember what the halting oracle was. You present it with any program, and that program and the halting oracle would tell you whether that program looped or it ran forever. Does the program loop or does it run forever? So here's the thing. Both you and I could write a computer program that looked at consecutive integers. And we looked at all the even numbers. We could start maybe at I don't know, at 8. I think Goldbach originally said it has to be greater than 2. But if we could look at 8, for example, okay, 8 is 5 and 2. Okay, well, we go on to the next, we loop. We go to the next one. We go to 10. Okay, 10 is equal to 7 plus 3. Okay, so we found two primes that add to 10. Okay, what about 12? Well, 12 is, what is 12? 7 plus 5. And so we began to loop, and every time we find a 2 prime numbers that describe an even number, we loop and we go to the next even number. And you and I could write a program that actually does this. And here's the interesting thing. If that program ran forever, we would prove Goldbach's conjecture. And in that program, if we found a counterexample, we would go halt, write out the counterexample and stop. Write out the counterexample and stop if we found a counterexample. But if it didn't halt, that means we've checked all the infinite number of even numbers, if you will, and we haven't found a counterexample. So we would give this Goldbach program to the halting oracle. And again, if it found a counterexample, it would halt, it would print out the counterexample, or it might not halt, it might run forever. If it ran forever, the Goldbach's conjecture would be true. So if it halts, it's a counterexample, and the conjecture is wrong. If it doesn't halt, the conjecture is proved. Notice the halting oracle can do this without actually running the program. The halting oracle says it can just inspect the program, and decide whether it halts or runs forever. This is non-algorithmic. You can't write a computer program to do that. The halting oracle does not have a the halting oracle does not exist. It's non-computable, so we don't have a halting oracle. And if we did, we could prove Goldbach's conjecture. It's the same thing with Legendre and Riemann. Both of those require a single counterexample. So we could do a program for Legendre's conjecture, and we could decide whether it halts. If it halts, his conjecture is wrong. If it runs forever, and the halting oracle says it runs forever, then we've proved Legendre's number. And then Riemann, same thing. Do we find one of these weird zeros that is against the Riemann hypothesis? Well, if we did, the program would halt. If it didn't, it would run forever. And so, and then at the bottom I wrote, and then there's Chaitin's mystical magical number. I showed you a picture of Greg Chaitin on the right. It turns out that he and I are acquaintances. We're not friends, but he lives in Brazil right now. I actually showed him a picture of the picture that I did of with ChatGPT of Gödel, Turing, and Chaitin, and I sent it to him. And he responded, I recognized the 2 guys on the left. Who's the guy on the right? Well, it's Chaitin, and he knew it was. And he says, just kidding. And he thanked me for doing that. But one of the geniuses of Chaitin, who was also a brilliant mathematician, I'm going to say something, and it's going to sound profound. there is a single number called Chaitin's constant that he discovered in high school. The genesis was when he went to high school. He actually published his first paper when he was 17. But he had this idea of Chaitin's number. If you had this number, one number, you could prove or disprove every open problem in mathematics that could be disproven by a single counterexample. That's an astonishing claim. One single number called Chaitin's number. And if you want to find out about Chaitin's number, one number that would prove Goldbach's conjecture, the Legendre hypothesis, and the Riemann hypothesis, as well as a slew of other open problems, then this one number would do it. And it's an astonishing piece of intellectual brilliance. You see this every once in a while and you go, wow, that's true. What are some of the other things we can prove? Well, here's some of the open problems that we haven't decided yet. There's Andriga's conjecture, and this is kind of interesting, that if you take two prime numbers, two consecutive prime numbers, and subtract their square roots, it's always less than one. That's kind of weird. And nobody has disproven this yet. There's Brocard's conjecture, and between n squared and n plus 1 squared, there is always at least 4 primes. Now, this is a generalization of the Legendre conjecture. And then the Collatz conjecture. Try this. This is fascinating. If you do a difference equation where the next number is equal to 3 times the previous number plus 1 if x sub n is odd, and you simply divide it by 2 if x is even. Now, you have to start this iteration at some point. It turns out no matter where you start this iteration, if you started at 7, 50, 2,624, no matter what number you start by, if you go through these two different pieces of two different steps, if you will, in the Collatz conjecture, you always go to 1. And it can hop all around. It can go up to 1 billion, and then, man, it just collapses back to 1. It is incredible, an incredible result. And again, Chaitin's number would solve all of these 3 problems in addition. Or more simply, if we had the Turing halting problem, we could write Collatz conjecture. We can start initialization at 3, start initialization at 4, start initialization at 5, and see if it went to 1. And if it did go to 1, we go to the next integer. And if we found a single counterexample where this did not converge to 1, we would disprove the Collatz conjecture. So we need to find a single counterexample. If it is true, and it works for all numbers, we can never prove it because there's an infinite number of initializations. There's a number of ways where you can initialize this very, very simple difference equation. So I think that is fascinating. So these are problems which we could also solve if we had a halting oracle, because we could all write a program to execute this, a search, if you will, a loop search, which exited and stopped the program if we found a counterexample. And if we use the Turing halting problem, we can indeed prove or disprove all of these. And there's a bunch of other problems. There's a big list on Wikipedia, by the way. If you go to unsolved problems in mathematics or open problems in mathematics, you'll find a big list of them. These are ones which are very easily expressed, and these are the reason that I cherry pick them. You don't have to have a big background in topology or anything else. These are all easily understood. So that's good. Now, we're doing this to, let's go back a little bit. We're looking at the halting problem. We've proved that the halting oracle cannot exist. If it did exist, all of these very interesting open problems in mathematics would be solved. But the halting problem is not computable. It doesn't compute. Now, Chaitin came along and he was able to actually prove that, yeah, there was a lot of other things which are non-computable. And we see this we see this all the time. Let me show you one of Chaitin's ones, which was really good. And this has to do, by the way, with compression. And this is, if you will, lossless compression. You're all familiar with JPEG images, which are actually lossy, but there's the PNG compression, which is non-lossy, and that's a generalization of GIF files. And so here's the idea behind one of the things that Chaitin showed about so-called elite programs. Suppose you and I were to write programs that computed pi to say 10 significant figures. We could all do that. There's a bunch of like Taylor series expansions, a lot of different ways to compute pi. If we did this, your program, one of our programs would be shorter than the other one. Clearly, because we would not write the same program. We would write a smaller program. Now, this is interesting that some programs to compute pi to send 10 significant figures are shorter than other programs which compute pi to 10 significant figures. This suggests, and this is a big deal, this suggests that there exists a computer program there exists a shortest elegant program. In other words, for a given programming language, there is a shortest program to compute pi to 10 significant figures. There is a shortest. We know that it's, excuse me, we know it's shorter than the shortest program that we've done so far, and we know it's bigger than 1 bit. So the shortest program to compute pi to 10 significant figures lies between 1 bit and the shortest program thus far generated to compute pi to 10 significant figures. But here's the interesting thing, is that this elegant program, proving the elegant program, is non-computable. In other words, you cannot tell whether a program is the shortest way of compressing a file. Now, we use compression all the time. In information theory, we talk about the Limpel-Ziff compression algorithm that is used to compress files such as zip files, and it's used for PNGs and GIF files also. But it is not the most efficient. There is better ways to compress those files. But this Limpel-Ziff program works really, really good on a lot of files, but it's not the best. There's other ways to do it. And if you have a certain thing that you want to do, if you have a picture, say a large picture that you want to compress, there is really no way to figure out what the shortest program compressed will express that result. This is something else which is non-computable. Now, before we get into the proof, let's see if I have time for the proof. It's 136. Okay, it's pretty short here. I think I'm not going to go to it. I'm going to give you the proof. Chaitin's really beautiful proof that this is true. By the way, the shortest program is called the elegant program and is the foundation of Kolmogorov complexity or algorithmic information theory. You're probably familiar with information theory due to Shannon, where he measures things in bits. Algorithmic information theory deals a lot with so-called Kolmogorov complexity and the shortest program to compute something. And it turns out that this is totally unknown. So with that, I think I'll go ahead and stop. And let me ask if there's anybody has any questions about what I've presented here, or any comments. Do you find this a little mind-blowing? I think it's a little different than things that you've seen before, but it really gets into the idea, and this is where we're going, by the way. It gets into the idea that if there are things in computers that are non-computable, are there attributes you and I have which are non-computable? And I maintain, yes, they are. And we're going to go through some of these properties that are non-computable. And how this dovetails into AI. AI often says that we are going to generate artificial intelligence that duplicates the human being and actually generates a supercomputer and super intelligence. Well, all of that assumes what? It assumes it assumes that we are computers made out of meat. And in order to duplicate ourselves, if a computer is going to do that, then it's limited to algorithmic ways of doing things. And if part of us is non-algorithmic, that means computer code cannot catch us. And we'll use this for a number of different examples. For example, there's people that want to live forever by uploading themselves. Well, if there's part of you which is non-algorithmic, and I maintain that there's obvious ones, loving, empathy, compassion. I don't think that computers will ever experience those. But there are deeper, and we'll make cases for this, that AI can never understand, it can never be creative, and it will never have sentience, it'll never have consciousness. And we're going to make the case for that, that these are non-algorithmic traits. And if indeed that is the case, which I think will make a strong case for, that means you can't upload yourself because you can only upload yourself the algorithmic part of you, that there's actually a part of you which is beyond algorithmic. Descartes looked at this and he said, well, I actually wrote a book here. Let me show this. This is my latest foray. We'll talk about this. It's called Minding the Brain. And what it is, it's about the case that that we are more than our brains, that the mind, if you will, is greater than the brain. And we'll make a case for that too, that the mind is greater than the brain because the mind can do non-algorithmic things. Okay, with that, are there any questions, any disputes? I love controversy. If you want to come at me for maybe not agreeing with some of the things I said, I'd love to hear about it.
I just have a
I
question about
oh
Chatton's number. It would be, so are you saying that that number is like quote unquote like a constant, like an
It,
integer, or would it be like an irrational number of some sorts? Or is it going to be like varying and have different variables in
well,
the
we
number?
know it's a number between 0 and 1, and it changes from computer code to computer code. C++ with certain attributes and subroutines has a different Chaitin's number than, say, Python does. But yeah, and here's the interesting thing. Chaitin proposed his number, but then, and this is profound, he showed that it was unknowable. Wow. Proving something exists and then proving that it's unknowable are very profound. If you look at the Kolmogorov complexity, the elegant program, the shortest program, that's something which is interesting. We know that a shortest program exists for computing pi to 10 significant figures. But we also know that it's unknowable. We don't know when we get to that program. We can only upper bound it. So I write a program, and the shortest program is either that program or something which is shorter. But if it is that program, we don't know if it's the program. So there are things which exist that are unknowable. And if you think of the philosophical implications of that, it's just astounding that there are things which are true and things which exist but are unknowable. And that's an example of Chaitin's number. The guy who's if you take the information theory course, the latter half of the course we spend on algorithmic information theory, which is some of the most mind-blowing stuff uh, you've ever seen. It's better than any fiction that you'll ever read, including science fiction. We were talking about science fiction before. It's just astonishing stuff. Any other questions or comments?
yeah, I have a question. It was about
Sure.
the list of fetishes, and it was and how he responded with how his is anything not on the list. What
Right.
happens if they write down that his fetish is anything not on that list? Would that make his response inconsistent, or
Yeah, it would be self-refuting because they would write that down and they would say, no, that's on the list. I only believe on things which are not on the list. So it's a self-contradictory statement. And that's the challenge with logical illusions. We can use logical illusions both in mathematics and in everyday reasoning. I look at scientism, for example, that says you can't believe in everything unless it's proved by science. That's a self-refuting statement. And there's people over in oh gosh, I'm thinking of Frank Beckwith, for example, that teaches logic and these self-refuting concepts. And this is essential for critical thinking. If you think critically about things, you always have to ask yourself, does a philosophy have this self-reference? And if it does, is it self-refuting? It's like Deepak Chopra. You believe that people have beliefs in order because of their insecurities. And the guy, Deepak, said, yeah. He says, do you believe that? He says, yeah. Okay, well, he believes that because he has insecurity if you apply that concept to itself. And that's the interesting thing about most of the examples that I've given. They're meta-analysis. They are analysis which applies a statement or a concept to itself. And that often is self-refuting. And we've seen, for example, with the halting problem, We assumed that there was a halting problem. Then we constructed a program which showed that it was contradictory, and therefore the halting problem doesn't exist because our initial assumption was wrong. In mathematics, they call that reductio ad absurdum. I think I said that right. And that's a common way of proving or disproving things in mathematics, is by using this concept. So very fascinating. Any other questions? Okay, well, really, that's good. I was either very clear or very obfuscating. I think that's what Charlie Bayless says after a lecture and nobody asked any question. He said I was really, really clear, or nobody understood what I said. Okay, thank you. We will see you all Thursday and continue this, and we will prove now that you cannot show that a program is the shortest elegant program. And it's an astoundingly simple proof that Chaitin came up with. I did some interviews with him, and one of the things that I did find out is that he says in his mathematics, and this kind of surprised me because he does have Chaitin's number. He also proved this idea of the elegant program. He said this was one of the most things which he had proved, which he was most proud of in his career. So we'll see that. And as you know, when you get into great mathematics, you get into simplicity. There was, oh gosh, okay, I'm drawing a blank in the name. Okay, Erdos, Paul Erdos. He said, there are proofs that go into God's book. And if you've seen some beautiful proofs in mathematics, I mean, you look at them and you see beauty. And my wife will look at a field of flowers and she says, "Oh, that's beautiful. I see God." I look at a beautiful math proof, or I look at something called something like Maxwell's equations, and I go, "Oh my gosh, I see God there." So because I see the implications and I see the beauty of it. So I see the beauty in the math, and my wife sees it in flowers. So everybody experiences God in a different way. So that's kind of interesting. Okay, guys. We'll see you on Thursday, same time, same station. And again, I'm wrestling with the video editing, so I'll try to get the other lectures up as soon as I possibly can. And you do have access to the slides now, so you can go back and you can review those. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.